Hi, and thank you for joining us for the Climate Extremes and Equity session. My name is Victoria Keener, and I'm a research fellow at the East-West Center, which is a nonprofit research and educational organization in Honolulu, Hawaii, that deals with communities in Asia and the Pacific Islands. I'm also the lead PI of the Pacific Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, or the Pacific RISA, which is one of 11 NOAA-funded RISA research grants that do sustained work with stakeholders on climate change research to try and help inform management and policy. My background is in hydrological engineering, but our team is also comprised of an interdisciplinary network of climatologists, both social and physical geographers, decision scientists, legal scholars, and economists, plus our large network of natural resource partners on the ground. Today, I'm going to start this off talking about inequity and climate extremes and how they increase risk in Pacific Island communities. So here's an outline of the talk I'll be giving today. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Pacific Islands region, since it's not always well known what the governance systems of the islands are, kind of the history of the area and the vastness of the region. Second, I'll go over the history of the Compact of Free Association, or the COFA, which is something you may or may not have heard of before, but is very relevant to how populations from different jurisdictions are experience the effects of climate extremes and impacts and the resources that are available to help them. Third, I'll go over kind of some basic definitions of equity and environmental justice and climate justice, and link it directly to climate and climate extremes and in the Pacific Islands context. Next, I'll go over some technical climate variables and indicators and actually show some of the observed and projected climate risks throughout the region that we've been experiencing already and are projected to experience in the future. Finally, I'll look across different sectors at the combined socioeconomic and climate impacts and risks on different communities through the region. And then we'll end up with some strategies that we've been using or looking at using to reduce inequities in response to climate extremes and adaptation throughout the region. So first, a brief introduction on the Pacific Islands region. And that right there are the Rock Islands in Palau. Which should be on everyone's list of places to go when we can travel again someday. Palau still has 0 COVID cases. So here's the region. This is Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific region, and it is the geographical scope that I'll be concentrating on today. So for our purposes, I will be concentrating on Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands, which are comprised of Hawaii, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, and the territories of Guam and American Samoa. What you see in green on the map there are the national monuments, and we also have some bases, some military bases throughout the region that I will detail as well. So issues of equity in this vast region start with the size and the diverse geographies that we have to deal with. They also are very varied governances throughout the region and varied socioeconomic conditions. The presence of the US military differs throughout the region, and also the climate data monitoring and modeling programs available are variable. So for example, the NARCAP downscaling that is available for the contiguous United States is not available in Alaska or Hawaii or the US affiliated Pacific Islands. Just some facts about the region. There are over 2,000 islands, over 1.9 million people, which doesn't sound like a lot to people from a mainland perspective, but on the size of these islands and the number of islands, it's quite significant. Again, there's varied governance. We have our US state and Hawaii, 2 US territories, both organized and unorganized, a commonwealth, and the freely associated states under the COFA, or the Compact of Free Association. There are several colonial histories at play throughout the region, US, British, and French, complex and varied geographies, with very wide-ranging elevations. The Marshall Islands, the highest point on the whole country, is 33 feet. And on the other hand, in Hawaii, the top of the highest volcano is over 13,000 feet. GDP is also very variable. In Federated States of Micronesia, the GDP per capita is about $3,400, while in Hawaii, it's about over $50,000 in 2016. There are a variety of US marine national monuments and military installations, such as the Kwajalein Missile Defense System in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And as I mentioned, national downscaling efforts often do not extend to Hawaii and definitely do not extend to the US affiliated Pacific Islands. So next, a bit about the Compact of Free Association. So the history and the purpose of the Compact of Free Associations was to make the citizens of the sovereign nations of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau have rights within the US, although they are not US citizens. These agreements date back to the Reagan administration and are related to the defense agreements. The citizens of those nations have US passports and can live and work in the US indefinitely, but they can't vote or serve in the military. There are about 16,000 COFA migrants that live in Hawaii in about 2017. The agreement is for 20 years and encompasses about $4 billion between those countries over those 20 years. It's going to be up soon, and it will be renegotiated in 2023 and 2024. So we're seeing that after decades of neglect by the US federal government, it's suddenly very interested in who these islanders are, what they want, and what will keep them from forming closer ties with China, who's throwing money and resources at their government for infrastructure and climate adaptation projects. One of the other key things about the COFA is that it gives the US military rights to patrol those waters. So no talk about equity and environment, climate, and the legacy on the peoples of the Pacific Islands can be complete without mentioning the history of thermonuclear testing in the Pacific Islands. So between 1946 and 1962, the US conducted over 100 atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests in the Pacific. One of the most famous that you may have heard of and has been talked about again and again in science fiction media and stories is the Castle Bravo explosion at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And actually 67 of those 105 nuclear tests were held in the waters and lands of the Marshall Islands. So they were affected very severely. Fallout actually fell on residents of the Rongelam and Utrik atolls. Inhabitants of the islands were not evacuated for 3 days and suffered severe radiation sickness. And actually today, COFA migrants that we see in Hawaii and through the US continue to suffer higher thyroid cancer rates than the general population. So this is all to say, really, that the systemic inequities of colonialism and nuclear testing continue to be experienced by Pacific Island communities today as they live and move around the region. So next I'm going to go into some basic definitions about equity as they apply to this talk and this session, and apply it in a Pacific Islands context to climate change and climate extremes. I won't spend too much time on these because you can pause the screen to read them later, but I did want to mention that there are several distinct concepts that apply to these types of discussions, and intentionally mention them now. So environmental racism, justice in how environmental laws are understood and applied, justice specific to how climate burdens and policies are understood and applied. And finally, intersectional environmentalism is kind of the ways in which all of these factors interact. So my group Pacific RISA has put together a list of resources and interviews and definitions on our website that we've been updating. So if you just go to our website, all of these definitions and a lot of resources are available there, just in one of the banner news stories that we have paging by. So you can check that out if you want to know more about any of this. So next, I wanted to link exactly how the impacts and changes in extreme events caused by a shifting climate are linked to issues of equity. As we've all heard, climate change is truly a threat multiplier. So climate change and the associated extreme events are a cross-cutting threat that will expose weaknesses and impact all societal systems and sectors. The failure to include these potentially affected groups in decision-making may result in a double injustice, by which I mean that groups who contributed the least to global carbon emissions, such as most Pacific islands, are excluded systemically from the benefits of climate adaptation and mitigation policies. This brings us to the point of time that we're in now. And I'll read this part. Given the uncertainty of federal funding for climate disasters and the or underinsurance of property nationwide, the inequality gap will widen without implementation of intentionally equitable and well-funded adaptation and mitigation projects. So in a Pacific Islands context, these issues manifest in several ways that I'll detail throughout the talk, but all stem from this key message we developed from Chapter 7 on Pacific Islands in the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment. And that is that indigenous peoples of the Pacific are threatened by rising sea levels, diminishing freshwater availability, altered ecosystem services, intensifying storms, and increasing temperatures. So you can go to Chapter 27 for a lot of what I'm going to talk about in terms of climate impacts, but the socioeconomic sectors that are impacted include things like fisheries and their associated livelihoods, agriculture and food security, human health, jobs, educational outcomes, and many things among that. So these are just some of the ways that this is impactful in a Pacific Islands context. Now this slide has a long title, but it's important, so I'm going to read it. Indigenous Pacific Island communities are disproportionately impacted by climate extremes due to historical governance structures. And what I mean by that are structures such as colonialism and military activity. So the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or USDN, defines 4 main types of equity that should be addressed. And as I define them here, I'll show you examples of how they are experienced in the Pacific Islands. So first, distributional equity are sustainability programs and policies resulting in fair distributions of benefits and burdens across a community, prioritizing those with highest need. So these could be, examples are things like initiatives that promote renewable energy that have the potential to benefit high-income households far more than low-income households in Hawaii. And for example, solar arrays and wind farms are often located in socioeconomically disadvantaged area. The next one is procedural equity. Whoops. Now, procedural equity is inclusive and accessible, authentic representation in processes to develop sustainability programs and policies. So in examples of procedural inequities could be local governance meetings for climate adaptation projects that are only held during normal work or school hours. So you're shutting out parts of the community that should be a part of that conversation. And this is a big problem with those of us who work regular hours and are trying to have workshops getting community input, but it's hard to make sure that there are chances for everybody to participate if they're interested. From a regional perspective, it could mean that the meetings that help govern the region in the Pacific Islands are usually only held in a few jurisdictions and systemically exclude some islands. Or as simple as the resources are not offered about sustainability and adaptation and climate extremes in the languages that are common to that island. Next is structural equity. And that means that decisions are made with a recognition of the cultural and institutional dynamics and structures that have routinely advantaged privileged groups and resulted in chronic cumulative disadvantages for other groups. So in the Pacific, this could be structural inequities could be something like FEMA. So FEMA disaster recovery funds are available to US states and territories, but not those Compact of Free Association states. Or territories and COFA states lack the human resources and often the scientific expertise to apply for grant funding and access climate funding that is supposed to be available to them to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change, but often they are unable to easily get that funding. And finally, I'll just mention again, the biggest example of structural inequity is the colonial history and the nuclear legacy of the US across the Pacific Islands, which has created distrust of federal institutions. Lastly, we have transgenerational equity. And transgenerational equity is how it sounds. It's that decisions consider generational impacts and do not result in unfair burdens on future generations. So an example in the islands could be that governments are prioritizing economic growth and growing tourism over resiliency and climate adaptation, or something as simple as a community building a seawall to keep current infrastructure and beaches protected, but not thinking about the impact that has on neighboring beaches and systems. Next, I'm going to go into more of the technical trends of the observed and projected climate risks for the region. And this will just be a brief overview of the types of extremes that we're experiencing and looking at experiencing in the future. So one of the main phenomena that causes year-to-year changes in the region is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or the ENSO. The El Nino and La Nina phases of ENSO dramatically affect precipitation, air and ocean temperatures, sea surface heights, storminess, wave size, and trade winds. For example, the El Nino phase brings very dry conditions to the north central and northwestern Pacific, including the majority of the US-affiliated Pacific Islands, and often results in severe drought. Increases in the strength of the El Nino and the La Nina events have been observed, although the link between these observed changes and human causes is unclear. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to exactly what the El Nino is going to do in the future as it continues to change. But we do know that however it changes, this is one of the regions that will be very impacted. This figure from our chapter in the NCA 4 shows how in Hawaii, temperature has risen by 0.76 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 100 years. And in this record, 25 and 2016 were the warmest years on record. Higher temperatures in turn increase evaporation, which reduce water supply and increase water demand. Average temperatures in Hawaii over the past century have shown a statistically significant warming trend. This figure shows the difference in annual average temperatures compared to the average during 1944 through 1980, with red bars showing above average temperatures and blue bars showing years with below average. Although I'm just showing the trend for Hawaii here, we could be looking at really any Pacific island across the region. Both average temperatures, maximum temperatures, and nighttime minimum temperatures have been increasing for the last 60 to 100 years, depending on how long the record we have is, which increase these possibilities of extreme heat impacts on health and also impact local freshwater, hydrology, and food security. So also in Hawaii, we've seen observed rainfall patterns shifting, and this has also been throughout the region. We see increases in some places and decreases in other places. There's a lot of microclimates on many of the high islands or the high volcanic islands with elevation. So Hawaii rainfall has been trending downwards during both wet and dry seasons for decades, with the period since 2008 being particularly dry. Actually, the most significant drought on record took place since then. Statistically significant trends in these observations are indicated with black hatching. So those percent, I can't tell if this is going to record my face over the bar there, but the percent change for decade and rainfall, you can see the western side of Hawaii Island has the most significant drying here, as I mentioned. And then we've seen both more consecutive dry days and wet days and increased extreme rainfall events from 1940 to 2010 on record. We also know that the impacts of sea level rise will be significant across the Pacific Islands. The Western Pacific has the highest global rates of sea level rise in the world in the early decades of this century. This map from the Sea Level Rise Report was completed in 2017 by the Hawaii State Climate Commission and was featured prominently in the National Climate Assessment. It highlights potential economic losses in the exposed area associated with 3.2 feet of sea level rise on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Potential economic losses in the darkest red are estimated from $50 to $150 million from impacts to land, residential, and commercial infrastructure. And so the circles indicate highly impacted areas with large economic losses, such as Pearl Harbor, and which is where the US Indo-Pacific Command is, and Waikiki, or the high tourism area. So in another role, I sit on the City of Honolulu Climate Change Commission that provides recommendations to the mayor about planning for these impacts, which allowed us to get this information into planning directives for all city agencies in 2018. Obviously, one of the equity issues that still needs to be addressed is overlaying this data with the associated socioeconomic data. So looking at how sea level rise, not just in millions of dollars, but in different communities with different resources are being impacted. Away from urban areas, many communities still rely on grown food and gathered food from the ocean and land. On atoll islands like those of the Marshalls and the Federated States of Micronesia, extreme high water events associated with hurricanes or waves threaten built infrastructure like homes and freshwater reservoirs like the one shown here, which is called the Runway Reservoir. All of that fresh water that you see is on the atoll, the thin strip of land, and is collected from the airport runway and drained into here. And that's the entire reservoir for the island. So sea level rise and hurricanes of increasing intensity will threaten atoll community sustainability in the future. Although it's uncertain, research also suggests that while hurricanes may decrease in number in the future, they may be intensifying. In addition, in the Central Pacific Basin, the region of cyclogenesis is shifting northward and threatening the Hawaiian Islands. In the west and southern basins, the area of cyclogenesis is projected to shift east. So we also know that rising ocean temperatures and acidification are threatening fisheries, coral reefs, and those livelihoods throughout the entire region. After the 2015-2016 El Nino event, over half of corals were lost in Western Hawaii. Coral losses also exceeded 90% at remote and pristine equatorial reefs such as Jarvis Island. Under projected warming of approximately 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, coral reefs will experience annual bleaching beginning in about 2040 throughout the region. Warming reductions on the order of the aims of the 2015 Paris Agreement would only delay the onset of severe bleaching by about 11 years. Coral reef projected cover is supposed to decline under the higher emission scenario, RCP 8.5, from the present level of 38% to 11% in 2050 and to less than 1% by the end of the century. There are also projected declines in longline fisheries and tuna and billfish yields by about 2 to 5% per decade. So the next thing I'm going to go over is some combined climate and socioeconomic impacts on different sectors, and looking how that impacts issues of equity in the region. So the rich cultural heritage of Pacific Island communities is comprised of spiritual, relational, and ancestral interconnectedness with the environment. It provides land security, water and energy security, livelihood, security, habitat, and cultural foods. Climate change is threatening this familiar relationship with the resources. Another modern impact is that from what we know from 2011 to 15 in Hawaii, about 12.5% of the native Hawaiian population worked in tourism-related industries. In a disaster like we're seeing now with the COVID pandemic and related shutdowns, that's an outsized impact on a population that was very reliant on the tourism industry, which is now almost completely shut down. In terms of drought and food security impacts, we see a lot of impacts of drought that are more impactful on atolls and remote islands just because they're farther away and they have less land and freshwater base. Across the region, 90 to 95% of food is currently imported. And if we look back, for example, on the 1997 El Nino, we saw coconut production decreased by 20% in the Federated States of Micronesia. And it took a while to recover, but it eventually did. We also see fisheries moving east with cooler waters surrounding FSM, CNMI, Guam, and Palau, while in RMI, the fish move north into deeper waters during an El Nino. So we see this movement of food. We also know that tourism livelihoods are affected, like I mentioned. There are reductions in tourism during natural disasters and climate disasters. There is a major die-off in Jellyfish Lake in Palau, which is a freshwater tourist attraction lake full of jellyfish. And it was, they all died off after the 2015-2016 El Nino, which was also related to drought and limited freshwater inflows. In American Samoa, drought led the cannery, which is the largest employer on the island of about 1,500 people, led it to need to ship in fresh water to be able to continue to operate. Subsistence fishing has always been impacted by bleached coral reefs and fisheries moving around as well. We also know there's a climate and human health impact. This is a diagram showing from the WHO showing impacts of climate change on human health. And we see it play out in the region on different populations. For example, in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, drought is highly linked with disease. In a study by the WHO, again, they found that diarrheal disease, malnutrition, vector-borne diseases, ciguatera, mental health, respiratory disease, NCDs, injuries, and other diseases were all related to climate changes, and many of those directly linked to drought, such as diarrheal disease and malnutrition. We also know that sea level rise from our research is not the main cause of environmental migration from the Marshall Islands. So a project that we worked on with the Pacific RISA and the Climate Adaptation Science Center in the Pacific Islands and the law school actually looked at the environmental causes of migration from the Marshall Islands to destinations in Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest. We surveyed 300 households on 3 atolls in the RMI, as well as an additional 80 people in the destination locations in Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest. So jobs, healthcare, and education were the main reasons people gave for leaving. However, 42% of people said that environmental factors had also influenced their decision. However, the leading climate impact driving them to leave was drought, which impacted more than 90% of the households in the last 5 years, which is somewhat of a surprising finding since much of the international media around climate threats to the RMI focuses heavily on sea level rise impacts on the atoll. Also interestingly, for Marshallese who had already migrated, sea level rise was identified as the main reason they were not planning on returning to the Marshall Islands to be with their families. These issues relate directly to health outcomes that are then experienced in COFA migrant communities in the US. Many COFA migrants are medical refugees that are seeking life-saving medical care, such as dialysis and chemotherapy, that aren't available in their home countries. Marshallese residents in particular struggle with cancers associated with nuclear testing in the region in the past. So discussing health and COVID along with climate extremes might seem somewhat indirect. However, the conditions that have caused that increased risk and vulnerability in these populations are precisely the ones that impact their resiliency and recovery during and after an extreme climate event. So similar intervention strategies that can address lessening the impact of extreme events on these populations that have been made more vulnerable through these systemic inequities can be used for climate as well. One of the things that has been found recently looking at COFA migrants in the US is that many states do not offer them Medicaid. So they're paying taxes, they're working, they have a passport, but they are not able to access Medicaid, federal disaster assistance, or food stamps. A few states in the US, California, New York, Oregon, Washington, do provide health insurance to COFA migrants, and a few more, Arkansas and Hawaii, provide it to specific populations such as pregnant women or blind people. Studies in Hawaii found that after Medicaid coverage was removed from the COFA population, Micronesians were hospitalized significantly younger and often sicker than their other ethnicities. And this is reflected directly in the trends that we see during COVID. This figure shows the COVID-19 cases per 100,000 people in Hawaii during July and August, this past July and August. So what this shows is that Pacific Islanders other than Native Hawaiians, so including those COFA migrants, have 10 times the infection rate of all the other ethnic groups in Hawaii. Furthermore, the rate of the COVID-19 infection in these communities is growing much more rapidly than the rest of the population, and that's something that we're still seeing. And these findings probably are not a surprise for those around the world who work with communities that have experienced many of these long-term inequities. Lastly, I wanted to end with some strategies that can and are being utilized to address inequities in response to extreme events in the Pacific. And the general frameworks of these are transferable. So this starts with recognizing that engagement in the region has historically centered largely around the strategic security value that the region has been assigned. However, Pacific Island countries have been driving regional agendas long before the US and China renewed their interest with the upcoming renewal of the COFA. So this is such as the Blue Pacific Declaration in 2017 through Pacific Islands Collective Diplomacy and the Boe Declaration in 2018. So throughout the region, climate change is recognized as a primary issue, followed by self-determination and demilitarization of the region. There's also a perceived lack of meaningful collaboration and engagement. So the perception that the US and the partners are not listening to the importance of climate as stated repeatedly by island communities and leaders, such as the stated intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement by the US. And there's also a fear and a perception that partnerships have remained transactional rather than having meaningful, sustained engagement in the region. And this can include a failure of coordination between countries or duplication of efforts and reactive policies. So what are things we can do to address these inequities or that are being done? Well, one of the strategies can revolve around co-production and co-design of research and adaptation plans for climate change and extremes. This starts with recognizing that there are fewer climate data available for Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands than the mainland United States, the contiguous states. What we need is eyes on the ground when things are changing faster than they ever have in terms of climate variables. We need to invest in maintaining long-term stations and increase monitoring. The figure on the right shows a decrease in stream gauges in Hawaii on the top and all other Pacific Islands on the bottom from 1910 to 2010. Less data available inherently creates an unequal opportunity for scientific research and advances in climate modeling. The fact that there's so much more data available for the Pacific Ocean surrounding the islands, but a dearth of land-based and freshwater data where people actually live point to where we as geoscientists have traditionally assigned importance. We can also include local organizations and governments as equal partners in the design and response to extreme events, learn from the actual affected communities and communicate through appropriate groups within those communities, maintain sustained and transparent engagement, provide resources to stakeholders that are appropriately translated, both in language and scientific accessibility, and that our messaging must include both personal action and systemic changes as we communicate. Finally, I just thought I'd end with some actions that we're doing on the local level. So as I said, I do sit on the Honolulu Climate Change Commission at the city scale. So here's some specific things that we've been doing to address inequities in climate extreme risks. And governments around the region are directly addressing climate inequity and starting to in their management and policies. So we're finishing up a set of recommendations to the mayor and city council on how to incorporate equity into climate planning. And 5 of our main recommendations were as follows. So center social equity in all of the plans dealing with climate change adaptation, identify potentially vulnerable groups in the climate change shocks and stresses, review the city's resilience strategy that was just completed with an equity focus on the 44 actions of resilience that were come up with the community, partner with communities to exchange information about risks, and focus on outreach to underserved communities, whatever those might be. So I'll end with that, and I'm happy to take questions in the discussion session with the other presenters. Here's all the information you can use to get in touch with me, as well as the websites for some of the projects that I work on, and then a list of resources that should have gone out earlier, but just in case you can look at these in case you're looking for other resources, either about climate impacts on the region or equity issues, both broadly and within the region. Thank you.